I guess I've been given the task to visit with you a little bit about the Waters of the United States rule for a couple of reasons. We have a rather extensive row crop operation along with our pork production operation and apply a lot of nutrients each year. So this issue has been kind of front and center for me as a producer, as well as a lot of other producers across the country. We've been, NPPC, fully engaged with EPA for quite some time now, as we knew this rule was coming. We submitted comments to the rule expressing our concerns about what their objective was, and the final rule, I think, was just issued last week, Michael, if I recall. I had it's kind of a busy week for me, but I had the opportunity to get through the first 100 pages of a 297-page rule that was issued. The purpose of the Waters of the United States rule was to clarify that the waters of the United States, the term waters of the United States. And I told Michael this, I was really frustrated after reading the first 100 pages. To me, as a producer, they did not accomplish that goal of clarifying the definition of waters of the United States. Actually, it appears to me that it's far more complicated than it ever was. If you do get time to look at the rule, you'll find that you'll spend about the first hour to get through 20 or 25 pages of legal cases to give reasoning on why they were writing a new rule. And then with some very complicated terminology to define what they think encompasses the waters of the United States. And when you start, reading terms like connectivity and nexus, my summary, I told Michael, of those first 100 pages was that we learned that water runs downhill. And I think we're going to be subject to jurisdiction in a lot of places that we were not under jurisdiction of EPA before. My concern is, and at this point in time, from what I can tell, we have had several meetings with Gina McCarthy and the water people at EPA. We're probably going to take the position of giving them the benefit of the doubt. She's announced that there are exemptions for agriculture. That was in the latter part of the rule. But I'm very concerned about that as a producer, and very concerned about it after reading what defines waters of the United States. It's my opinion that it'll be an attorney's haven or a gold mine on both sides of the issues. I can see activist groups wanting more clarification or more expansion, saying that certain tributaries and waters are subject to the rule. They're going to challenge the exemptions that Gina was talking about. And at the same token, if I want to do a conservation project on my farm and I have to, it involves a wetland or tiling or whatever it may be, it's another level of bureaucracy that I'm very concerned about having to get permits to accomplish that. None of those details were really clarified in the rule, other than the fact that we're taking Gina's word, or at this point in time I am, that agriculture will have some long-standing exemptions.
And water runs downhill.
Yeah, when you read through that, as an Iowa farm boy, that's what it told me. And if that, in fact, is their definition, that connectivity of waters and streams and tributaries, which grow as water gets to the Gulf of Mexico and it's not only agriculture, it's a big concern for agriculture, but it's also going to affect urban areas as well. It's going to affect construction. Their jurisdiction would have long tentacles as far as having to get permission to do things that affect the waters of the United States. So, Michael, I don't have a lot further comments. I think Michael and I visited a couple times. We're in a position that we're going to probably let some time pass here. We're keeping in close contact with other agricultural groups that are reviewing the rule. I think some time will pass before we take a hard-nosed position on it. I know in Congress there's a lot of concern about giving EPA the authority to regulate all of these streams and tributaries across the country. So we're going to kind of wait and see how this plays out. To me, it's unquestionable that there'll be legal action, and like I said, probably on both sides of the issue. Michael would be the next up, and glad to answer any questions that we can.
Last week I was in a conversation with the Farm Bureau, and they called it the largest unmitigated land grab in the history
of the world. Yes.
And I don't know if that's hyperbole, but have
No.
you seen a number where this is how much it increases, or how many acres, or how many miles?
Early on, so as John said, we submitted comments. I've actually drafted like 4 sets of comments on this thing in hundreds of pages, and we've been engaged with them. Early on last year, maybe a year and a half ago, we had produced a whole series of maps showing what the impact would be using EPA's own data and the U.S. Geological Services data, where we believed, as it was proposed, it was going to pick up new jurisdiction. Within the state of Missouri, when we did that initially, they were able to calculate that 80% of Missouri was going to be covered as a jurisdictional water by EPA. I don't know if you've ever walked down the street in St. Louis or Columbus or really anywhere, but you're walking down the street, but under the EPA's rule, it's going to be water. They haven't narrowed that down. They haven't shrunk that amount. If anything, they've expanded it. So anywhere you have a stream or a ditch, you then have a floodplain, and everything in the floodplain can be included. And if the floodplain doesn't extend far enough, they're then going to extend it 1,400 feet anyway. If it's intermittent, if it's a regular full-flowing stream, I believe it was 4,000 feet, which is like 3/4 of a mile. So just look around anywhere where you see stream and go 3/4 of a mile, and now they're going to say we're going to get everything there. In the upper Midwest, I was talking to Joy here about this earlier. They have prairie potholes, they're depressions. There's not a single prairie pothole that's going to hold enough water, and most of them are pretty far removed from these flowing streams. So EPA's approach, because water runs downhill, is we'll take all of the prairie potholes in a given watershed, and the Mississippi would be a given watershed, and we'll add them all together. And if, in our opinion, there's a substantial amount of water when you've added every single one of these 2 to 3 acre, semi-wet, areas together, what is a substantial amount of water? They still haven't told us. Well, then we're going to just declare jurisdiction over everything. And there's plenty of exemptions which they've talked about here for agriculture. That's been sort of the focus of what they've been doing. But those exemptions all have exemptions. So in Iowa, 49% of the soils are hydric soils. I know to be a wetland, you need to have a hydric soil and hydric vegetation, and presence of water. And so 49%, almost all of the north central Iowa's hydric. They created drainage districts like the ones that Des Moines has just sued, so you could live in Iowa because it was an inhabitable swamp filled with yellow fever and all sorts of diseases, and so they drained the land so people could live here and farm it and create food. Well, because those used to be wetlands a couple of 150 years ago, they would now be considered wetlands under the rule, as it appears to be written. The ditches, which are supposed to be exempted according to EPA's press statements, wouldn't be exempted because they were draining a former wetland, and or if the ditch is an improvement, if you've taken an existing stream and you've relocated the stream, or you are improving or straightening the stream or maintaining, dredging it so it can carry more water. Or if you even have a ditch that somehow doesn't fit within their definition, if you get water in there that comes from an area that they could cover, or because water flows downhill, the water eventually flows out of it into an area that they have jurisdiction over, they will assume jurisdiction over everything. And that means all manner of trouble with construction, as John said, stormwater management, how a city is going to control rainwater. We actually had 15 or 20 members of the Office of Water here yesterday. We did a little discussion with them and took them around, and it was raining yesterday morning, so I joked and I said, well, you see, they've grabbed jurisdiction over the air right now all around us. And they were a little ouchy about that, but they didn't deny it. And so...
Michael, can you explain that while EPA may not actually say, oh, because of this scenario,
sure,
that others can?
Well, yeah, and that gets to what John was mentioning, that there's going to be lots of litigation. So EPA hasn't. This is a giant land grab, but they said it wasn't a major rule, which is how they were able to keep people from weighing in and expedite its process. They haven't actually put any standards in place, so there's no permits that come with this. There's no limits on how much manure you can put down, on how much pesticide you can put down. They've only said this is what we can control, which means now they can start working on creating those limits. More importantly, and where the lawyers are going to have a field day, and so maybe that's good for me. I'm not sure. You'll have activist groups are going to begin filing lawsuits, and they're going to take activities that they don't like, or they're going to target people who they see as having a deep pocket, and they're going to begin hammering away, and they're going to use this rule then to expand their reach. And for instance, I got in trouble prior to the proposal of the rule. We had a meeting at USDA, and it was all of the agriculture groups in Washington, and I pointed out to one of the more senior people at USDA, and there's maybe 3 or 4 people, and she's a little higher than that, that there's no exemption in the Clean Water Act for farming, that actually planting a seed, if it falls into a water, the seed itself is a pollutant because it's not naturally there. And so, in theory, you could be forced to have to get a permit to plant your seeds. We've seen them fighting and forcing permits for pesticides. They'd love to force permits for applying manure, applying anhydrous, but they can actually permit you for having a seed. And everyone was looking at me and saying I'm ridiculous, and I was told never to mention that again because there'd be consequences to pay, and how dare you ever allege that we were going to do something like that. And I don't think they really understood at that point what they were proposing. And so it comes down to just how the Clean Water Act defines this. But there's a Supreme Court case. Robert Kennedy and Waterkeeper had sued the U.S. Navy to stop the operation of the bombing range at this naval base off of Puerto Rico. And the Supreme Court agreed with them that an F-14 is a point source, and the missile it shoots is a pollutant. And so the U.S. Navy, every time it's got their fighter planes that are running, and the fighter pilots are training for war, they have to get permits. They're not publicly available permits because there's national security protection, but they actually have to go and file and get a permit. And if they're able to claim that a fighter jet is a point source, and at the gun range, the things they're training with are pollutants, well, it's pretty easy for them to then turn around and say, a seed of corn is going to be a pollutant because it's all the same concept, and you don't have the exemption. EPA is not going to go do that, but you could imagine an anti-GMO group turning around, going and finding someone in a bottomland farm, and say we don't want the Monsanto seed because Monsanto is evil, and they start there and they start working their way up. I certainly expect to see the Humane Society pull out all sorts of cockamamie things now. And that's a technical term, the cockamamie. We'll see. Waterkeeper is certainly going to be more active here. This will piggyback onto environmental justice is their new area that they're pursuing as well. That there's disparate impacts, and so it just gives them more tools to come after and harass otherwise, law-abiding, hard-working citizens.
Has there been, I thought there was legislation that was introduced to stop EPA. What's the gist of that, or does it do that?
It would, there are a couple of bills out there. One just passed out of the House, and so it's back to the Senate. It's in the Senate, and we're looking for a couple more Democrats to sign on. I think we have 57 co-sponsors. There are a number of Democrats who said that they wouldn't sign on to it until the final rule came out and they had a chance to read it, which I think is that's fair and reasonable position. And like John said, I got pretty strong feelings, but we're not positive exactly all the ways in which this is going to impact us, and so we're working through. I've got a giant chart I'm making, and so it'll take some time. That would withdraw the rule and would force EPA to go enter into a series of consultations with the states, and then stakeholder groups, primarily states, because the states aren't happy about this either. This has real impacts on state budgets, on the state's autonomy, on Iowa or Minnesota is where you're going to see Minnesota probably gets hit the worst. All the water in the state is already regulated, so they don't have the problems that EPA was trying to solve. But what they've done now is they've created a system where an activist group in San Francisco can decide they don't like that Minnesota has made this decision to take Minnesota's money and put it here, that they ought to put it here. And that's a distinct, whether Minnesota wants to build a park or they want to improve a stormwater sewage system 500 miles away in a different part of the state. That's the kind of thing that states get together and the citizens get together and they prioritize and they plan and see what they want. Well, that's going to be taken out of their hands because now this is all controlled by federal law, subject to citizen suits which can be filed anywhere. So Minnesota might find itself having to fight a lawsuit filed in New York City over how Minnesota is going to control its spending of budget dollars and resources.
So what are the next steps as far as NPPC is concerned?
So getting back to Chad's question about Bill, so we've got this legislation in the Senate. We're trying to figure out and chart exactly all the ways this is going to impact us. Go work and find a few more sponsors in the Senate. Hopefully, we'll have a bill coming up soon. There was a test vote a month ago or so in the Senate. There was Republican language, got 59 votes in support of, and that would pull the whole thing back and make EPA wait a few years. Then Debbie's 59 votes would have got 60 votes, but I think Ted Cruz was in Iowa campaigning or something. The Democrats, Debbie Stabenow, introduced language which is much closer to what is in the Senate now, and that received 99 votes. I'm pretty sure Ted Cruz, had he not been campaigning, would be voting along with everyone else. And I don't know of too many instances when essentially 100% of the U.S. Senate is in full agreement that something is just a dumb, bad idea. But that's what we have now. So we're hopeful they'll pass something. There's bound to be litigation over this, and we're looking at all the options.
Will you be part of that?
We're looking at all the options.
Yeah. I mean, I think clearly the failure of EPA was to engage business and industry in writing the rule. Gina made that statement that they did engage all these people. They engaged a lot of activist groups. They addressed those court cases that helped try to define what actually were waters of the United States. But they didn't really engage agriculture or a lot of other industries as they should have before the rule was written. that's where I think the biggest failure with this is. From our standpoint, we're all in favor of clean water, but there's a right way to go about it, and I keep coming back to what we're doing here in Iowa with the nutrient reduction strategy. Those types of initiatives that farmers get excited about, that they can measure the improvement that they make, and EPA's attitude is we regulate first. We require permitting, which raises costs and slows down the procedure to implement modern technology or newer practices. So I think that's the frustrating part about it with me. We all want the same objective of having clean water, and we can make huge strides in doing that. But to not be engaged in the development of the regulation, I think was a big mistake, and I think that's where they fell short. I think we'd be very much in support of repeal or whatever it is, Michael, that happens to the bill and starting over and engaging agriculture, the different segments of agriculture. This is going to affect everybody. It's not just pork producers. It's going to affect all of agriculture in a big way, and that's a concern.
Feel EPA, is there any good intentions anywhere underlying there, or is it just some misguidance? I know in Minnesota, you had this mandatory buffer situation come up during the legislative session, and it just pinned everybody in farming as you're against clean water. It put everybody in such a bad corner and gave everybody a bad taste in their mouth. And I don't know if they're any good or their intentions good, just misguided, or all of that.
For a lot of the people there, and certainly the administrator of EPA, this isn't her focus. She was hired to do climate change air work, but it's one of the things that was on her plate. And I do believe that she did what she could do. She's not reading a 400-page rule. She has staffers who are going to tell her. She'll go to them and say, we need to exempt agriculture. Secretary Vilsack told her initially you need to exempt agriculture, so they created these provisions to exempt agriculture. But the devil's always in the details, and when the staff that you've employed, and sometimes senior staff in management, come from rabid activist groups, they have read the provisions and they say, okay, we've created these exemptions. Wink, wink, nod, nod, but the exemptions all have exemptions which make them completely meaningless and in fact expand everything. And so there are individuals there certainly, who are trying to do the right thing, and it's a rule. One of their best defenses is everybody's asked for them to do it, and it's true. There was some Supreme Court cases that created confusion and uncertainty, and so they had to do something. But a lot of it's misguided. A lot of it is overreach. A lot of it's just fundamentally not understanding the world around them. They live in the little bubble of Washington D.C. and it takes 100 pages to tell you that water flows downhill.